Okay, we're going to start very soon. Good morning, everybody. Just a quick little reminder. So, in all the lectures that I've been in, I found that like there's a lot more engagement and like visual feedback for the lecturers if um, everyone in the audience has like their face cams on. So, if you're in a position to do so, or if, like you have the capability to do so, like feel free to turn your face cam on. It will make the lecture more engaging and help us know like when we're, help us know like more immediate feedback, basically. So feel free to do that. And so we'll start this lecture off. Start off by introducing ourselves. So my name is Kenneth. I'm a rising sophomore. So when the fall starts, I'll be in my second year. I'm studying industrial engineering and operations research, as well as electrical engineering and computer science, and potentially business administration at the University of California at Berkeley. And yeah, I'm a Davis High alumni. I did, in my brief career in speech and debate at Davis High, I did Lincoln Douglas, I did parliamentary, and I did public forum debate. So I'll pass off the introduction to Connor.
Hi, I'm Connor. Not quite as cool as Kenneth over here. Most importantly, he was also an ex-ASB president at Davis High during his little stint here. I'm going to be one of your captains next year, so I'm pretty excited to get this going. So welcome everybody that's here for the 10 a.m. Intro to Economics.
Okay, I think we're going to start the lecture off. And a quick like reminder before we get into the content. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to like type into the chat or try and sort of respectfully interrupt us, if you will, because I think questions are always going to be very important. But I'll pass this off to Connor.
So economics is pretty complicated. So in order to explain the basics, we're going to pass it off to whoever can explain it the best, which in here, we're going to leave to an animated YouTube video. We don't have video sound.
Walks into his first economics class with very little idea of what economics is. He might have heard something like, economics is the study of money, or economics is another word for accounting, or economics is hard, don't take that class. But none of those are true. Economics is the study of the use of scarce resources that have alternative uses. That's the classic definition of economics. Basically, there are people, and people need resources to fulfill their desires. These resources cannot be infinite, but the desires can be, so people need to make choices about how to use their scarce resources. Economists study these choices. All economic questions fall into one of two categories, positive and normative. Positive economics describes what is, and normative economics argues for what ought to be. So a question like, why do people use money, is a positive question, and should people use money is a normative question. A general rule of thumb is that if your economic model has no value judgments, it's positive economics. Whereas if it does have value judgments, it's normative economics. Since to tell someone what he ought to do, you first have to judge what is best for him. Economics is also divided into microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics studies the behavior of individual agents and markets, while macroeconomics studies the behavior of the entire economy. Economists also have their own branch of statistics called econometrics that specialize to analyzing economic data. Since economic data usually comes from the real world and not from controlled experiments, econometrics faces mathematical challenges that other fields might not. The tools economists have developed to study human behavior have broad uses outside of what we would traditionally consider economics. Economists study not only markets, but things like crime, war, the family, religion, culture, politics, criminologists, political scientists, anthropologists, biologists, neuroscientists, or legal scholars being co-authored by economists.
So economics by definition focuses on the analysis of the relationship between production, distribution, and the consumption of goods and services. So as that video outlined, studying economics can help answer some of the world's most pressing questions, like why some countries are rich and some are poor, why wealth and income become increasingly unequally distributed over the past few decades, and how an aging population might affect life in the coming decades, and how the workforce will also change with advances in robotics, automation, and AI. So as debate gets more advanced, you'll probably begin to see more of this type of applied theory. So let's just get into like the basic concepts. Sorry about if you guys can hear the phone in the background. I'm not too sure, but if so, I apologize. So the YouTube video briefly topped up on micro and macroeconomics. Microeconomics essentially details the decisions made by units within a system. This could be like how somebody decides to budget their paycheck every month, while macroeconomic tends to focus on the system itself, or the bigger picture, as we like to call it. Since debate generally covers scale topics like policy changes or these types of big picture topics, macroeconomics will probably be more useful in context. But if you do end up liking economics as a subject, definitely look into both because micro and macro are incredibly interesting, but they also are really, really useful. So if you're interested after this lecture, definitely check out some of the concepts that we talk about. So macroeconomics was coined by British economist John Keynes in the 1930s while trying to understand the Great Depression. He advocated heavily for increased government expenditures and lower taxes in order to help stimulate demand to combat the depression. This kind of became the beginning of the distinguishment between macro and microeconomics. With time, macroeconomic policy began to strive for full employment, high living standards, price stability, a reduction of economic inequality, and rapid economic growth, and steady foreign exchange rates. So that sounds like a lot, but we can look at some of the more prominent ones. One of the ones that we seem to talk about pretty much every day is striving for maximum employment. So as a idea, the government should strive to ensure full employment to the citizens, and by doing so, the effect is felt directly by the individuals. For developed countries, around a 5% or less employment rate is considered pretty good. For perspective, as of February of 2020, before all of COVID happened, the US had around a 3.5% unemployment rate, which is pretty good. And now in June of 2020, it rests at around 11%, just as perspective as to how significant certain events can be towards unemployment. So it makes sense why having jobs is good. If you don't have jobs, the economy is wasting a precious resource of labor potential, and that means fewer goods and services will be produced and consumed. So in a less quantifiable metric, jobs also represent people's livelihoods and their ability to live, be productive, happy citizens, and own the means to do what they want with their lives. With this, another term you'll be hearing thrown around a lot is GDP and high levels of output. So essentially, the ultimate aim of the economy is to provide the desired goods and services. And so gross domestic product measures that market value of the entire output that a country puts out during a certain year. And this can help draw a picture of a country's economic performance as well as growth, and that is called nominal GDP. As compared to real GDP, which is basically nominal GDP, which is like everything considered based on the prices that is currently going on, and then adjusted for inflation, which is like, the overall picture. So that's like real GDP. And then GDP is often used to implicate a country's standard of living, and then that can be used to try to predict the future of an economy with long-term trends. Like you might look at multiple different years of GDP and see either if it grows, stays the same, or is getting lower. And then even though in debate, GDP is probably the metric you'll hear most often, it isn't the best to use in a lot of situations. Um, since economics is such an entanglement of so many different variables and GDP really only shows the net averages, it's not comprehensive enough to show certain metrics, such as the wealth gap, for example. That's where other metrics come in, such as purchasing power parity, commonly referred to as PPP, and that tells how strong currency is by how much stuff that currency can buy, or the Gini coefficient, spelled Gini, which is good for showing wealth distribution as well as like holistic quality of life. We also have some economic analysis. So before jumping into economics in debate, it's important to realize some of the fundamentals of economics and kind of human nature ideas that you can apply. So economic analysis and supply and demand are typically probably going to be the most prominent, I guess, like justifications you'll hear. So it's good to know that there will always be human desire. It could be, for example, for mansions, luxury, fame, happiness, and all of that to an unlimited degree. But there will always be limiting factors, and most notably, we can look at time and money. Oftentimes, economic theories and analysis target how humans and economic units deal with scarcity and choice. So in a free market economy like ours, the freedom of choice is boiled down to opportunity cost, which basically means the next best alternative choice that is foregone, meaning not taken. For example, you can only eat one type of sandwich today when there are a lot of options. So if you eat this one, you can't eat the other. So what do you lose out on if you choose option A over option B? And so this concept of opportunity cost is frequently used in policy debates, actually, but pretty much every debate. For example, one of the more, I guess, realistic examples would be the guns versus butter debate. A society can choose to give up guns, more military spending, or sorry, can choose more guns, for example, spend more on the military. But in the context of limited resources, you have to give up the butter, which in this case could be spending on human needs or resources. So for a real example is that during the military buildup and wars during the George W. Bush presidency, many argued that the additional military spending had large opportunity cost. The money spent on the military could have been used, for example, to provide more healthcare for the uninsured, invest in greater energy efficiency, or a number of other alternatives. And so this opportunity cost of the spending is the benefit that could have been achieved from the most valued of these alternatives versus what it was currently spent on. And so this type of quote unquote weighing is a key idea in debate that gets used a lot when you're comparing your ideas versus somebody else's ideas.
I'll go over the slide. So I just want to reiterate, a lot of the topics we'll talk about today, like, can be very abstract and very sort of academic, but the goal of this is to sort of inform you on how you can use economic analysis to help you win rounds, basically, in debate. And what Connor said earlier about both weighing and also sort of analyzing how GDP as an impact is used in debate is very critical and very important, because I guarantee you, you'll go into so many rounds where people will misconstrue economic concepts and economic ideas such as GDP, and you can get some free, easy wins just by like knowing that they're doing it wrong, basically. So we'll go over something that I think is probably the most bread and butter concept of economics, and many of you have probably seen this before, but essentially the law of supply and demand. And the reason why it's called the law of supply and demand is not because it's like some sort of enforced legislation, but rather because it's a sort of natural tendency for things to have, for sort of the prices of goods or products in a capitalist society. So essentially what the law of supply and demand is saying is that, let's say you have some product, right, or some good, which is, we could use the previous example of like, say, butter, right? And basically the price, the equilibrium price of this good or product that will be the market price of butter is determined both by the demand of buyers and by the supply of sellers. So I think the easiest way to understand how this works is because basically like your suppliers, right, your sellers who create the butter, who turn the butter and end up selling it to market, they need a certain price to recuperate their costs and also, you know, feed their families, right? So they'll set a varying set of prices, say like $10, $9, $8, $5, and they'll sell that at different quantities. Now, your buyers, on the other hand, want butter, right? But they only want to pay a certain amount, right? Because you don't want to be paying too much. So they'll pay, say, like $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 for butter at also different varying quantities. And basically the intersection of like both the exact amount of quantity and the exact amount of prices determines the equilibrium price for the market. You don't have to understand like too exactly how to calculate this or like how this will affect you, but the main thing to understand is basically just the law of supply and demand determines prices and is the reason why like the prices of goods and products will change, or is the reason why like there are certain prices. And the way you can use this in like a economic round or a debate is looking at pharmaceuticals, right? So one of the most important, I remember it was a public forum topic a year ago or a semester ago, and it was essentially talking about using price controls on pharmaceuticals. And to summarize it, basically, like you can use your understanding of the law of supply and demand to counter some arguments regarding using price controls on the price of pharmaceuticals. But yes, on to the next slide. Pass it off to Connor.
Let's take a look at some of the major economic systems. So we have the common capitalist system that we know of, which is all about owning your own stuff. And inside that, there are two types of capitalist systems, one being CMEs, also known as coordinated market economies, and LMEs, known as liberal market economies. But those kind of get into like a depth that we don't really need to know. So we can save that for another time. Then we have command economies, such as the Soviet Union, where it's pretty much totally managed by the government and is pretty much associated with dictatorships. So that you probably won't see in debate too much. A bit less common, we also have traditional economies, which are seen with underdeveloped rural or farming nations, where customs and history or time-honored beliefs are typically valued higher than defined conditions, which is why we might see bartering be more popular than money in those types of systems. Again, those you probably won't see too much inside debate. Next slide. Now we get into the bigger ones. Socialism advocates for a more collective ownership and a more hands-on approach into the means of production and distributions. And in this case, values equity over efficiency to a degree higher than capitalism. And communism shares in some senses, some ideas with socialism, but has absolutely no private holdings, and in general strives for a set of ideals. And at the moment, you don't really see any countries that explicitly define communism. And then, so lastly, we have like the big one, which is mixed systems. So this is just like the most industrialized economies, such as the U.S., for example. But it's pretty much like embodies every other like country in the entire world. It's like really hard to have exactly one sort of system. But as you see with a lot of industrialized states, you will have a mix of capitalist and socialist themes. But I think, in my opinion, it's still helpful to define like all the extremes so you can see how each one really applies in like, I guess, each situation for different nations.
Just to interject, Kessler asked in the chat, what is martial force?
Oh, so basically it's military controlled. Let's call it that.
Okay.
Okay, so then now we're going to go on to another sort of aspect of macroeconomics, and more specifically, like another division in how you'll study and you'll like learn about macroeconomics. And this is a division between fiscal policy versus monetary policy. So they are both policies in the sense that they are like government actions or government policies that will affect economic growth in some sort of way, right? So when you're in a debate round, like the main agent of the main actor or the main agent that you'll be talking about, who is going to be like executing the resolution, right? So really the main entity that you'll care about is probably like the US government, or it's some sort of other governing agency, but it's generally some sort of big governmental body, right? So this is very important because knowing the difference between fiscal versus monetary policy can help you determine how exactly a resolution or a plan will be implemented in a debate round. So when we talk about fiscal versus monetary, the main difference is who is the agent. So in the US, fiscal policy refers to like any policy that's created by, or any sort of legislation that affects economic growth created by by Congress, right? So Congress is our US legislative body, and basically they have two main functions or two main ways that they can affect economic growth, and that is through controlling the amount of taxes and controlling the amount of government spending. So essentially, like, there's a lot of different hidden variables that go into this, but essentially Congress can reduce taxes and thus sort of encourage like economic growth, or they can increase taxes, which reduces economic growth. And in the same sense, they can also use government spending, because government spending is another factor of GDP. And so when the government spends more, they end up encouraging economic growth, and vice versa. When the government spends less, they will be sort of discouraging or not increasing economic growth as much. And this is more of the political side of things, because obviously the officials in Congress who make these decisions are the ones who are elected. But yeah, in terms of monetary policy, this is referring more specifically to the Federal Reserve, and is probably less likely to be discussed in your debates, but it's still very important to know how big of an impact they have on economic growth, and how their actions can also affect the economy. And it's also important to like understand how you could potentially use this sort of less talked about but also very important actor in your rounds. So the Federal Reserve is basically the US's central bank, and they have three main ways they can control the economy and improve and affect the economic growth. And basically these three main ways I'll go over in the next slide, or in another slide, but essentially it affects the interest rate and affects money supply. So this helps to control for inflation, which is basically the increase in the price level. So which affects like the prices of goods and services relative to like the buying power of the dollar, right? But essentially they can, using their different tools, they can also affect the economy as well.
On what Kenneth was talking about like government influence in economics, or in the economy, I guess. Inflation also is like really important in this like big picture. So inflation generally has like a really negative connotation towards it, because it's kind of used like as a buzzword for every bad economic time and period. Like there's always a generic example for like when money is printed, then everything costs more money since the power of each unit of currency has decreased, and then you're just left with a bunch of worthless paper. But it's really not like that much of a distinct issue. It's not even always a bad thing. So inflation, like by definition, is the change in general price level in the economy. So naturally, inflation rises around 1 to 2% annually. And so this moderate amount of inflation is actually considered to be a sign of a healthy economy, because as the economy grows, demand for stuff increases. And so this demanded stuff pushes prices a little bit higher, because these suppliers will try to create more of the things that consumers and businesses want to buy. So this sometimes translates into worker benefits, because this type of economic growth may drive a higher demand of labor, and as a result, wages can increase. And so these workers with higher wages can go out and buy more stuff and contribute more to the economy, creating this benign or positive cycle. And so this is like in general really good for the economy. Um, Granted that it's actually important to know that inflation isn't necessarily the cause for like all these benefits, but it's just a sign of like the healthy economy that's consistently growing. Um, but like the extremes of low inflation and high inflation are actually like really bad. So these are like definitive. So low inflation usually signals that like the demand for goods and services is lower than it should be. And this tends to lead to slow economic growth and can depress wages. And so this low demand can actually lead to a recession when you have, for example, increases in unemployment. And this is like pretty evident about like a decade ago, like during the Great Depression or the Great Recession. And deflation, however, is like especially bad because when prices are decreasing, consumers will delay purchases, and for sometimes for very long periods of time. Um, it also discourages lending because it leads to lower interest rates, and lenders typically don't really want to lend money at rates that will not net them a large amount of money back. And so this is like a major problem with the EU right now. This like hopefully will come up this year in one of like in some debate topic because I really like this topic, but currently the EU is struggling to get people to take out loans. So they've actually resorted to long-term negative interest rates, which historically has like never really been done for like long periods of time. So we're gonna see like a lot of how policy might change in the upcoming years as economies become more volatile. And this is like a pretty advanced topic, but if you guys are interested, definitely look up negative interest rates because like this is like a really fine line balance on how economics is actually managed. But that again is a topic for later. But like just as too low is bad, too high inflation is also bad, and this can cause extreme economic shutdown, slowdown, or unemployment. So this balancing act is like incredibly tough again, and it's kind of frustrating probably for government officials because like whether or not to inflate the cost of taking loans, for example, to slow down economic growth or like encourage lending can like cause extremely impactful impacts, like or incredibly impactful consequences, and typically in domino effect because like by you, for example, making loans more expensive, somebody might not take loans and might not buy something like a house, for example. And all this really translate on like a wider scale to the degree where like, you never really know what's going to happen. So like, again, like try to look into the EU. I think it's like really interesting on how difficult it really is to get this balancing act right.
Okay, we're going to talk about one of my favorite things, the Federal Reserve. And the absolute beauty on the right is Jerome Powell. He is the current chair of the Federal Reserve, and basically he's like calls the big shots at the Fed. So the Fed has a dual mandate, and I think Connor covered this earlier, but basically, to sum it all up, their main goal is to keep stable prices, so or relatively stable prices. So basically, keep the inflation rate at around that nice 1 to 2%, and also attain maximum stable employment. Right. So this is another fancy way of saying lowering unemployment as much as possible. So when we talk about inflation, just to go over it again, basically it's referring to a price level increase. I think the best example that can summarize this and something that you can actually use when researching or doing your own sort of prepping for a round is to look at like inflation rates through the Big Mac index, right? So in 1986, I think is when McDonald's introduced the Big Mac and it costs $1.60. In 2012, the Big Mac costs $4.20, right? But the inputs and like what goes into a Big Mac haven't really changed that much. Rather, it's the price level increase that has really changed. So you can use that index, or you can use the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, if I remember correctly, and that's basically just a basket of goods that your typical like consumer will use, and it tracks like how the price of that has increased over time, and that sort of reflects inflation levels. Let's see. So there are three main tools that the Fed has at their disposal to achieve the dual mandate. So to both make sure that inflation is at a nice healthy 1 to 2%, also decrease unemployment as much as possible. So they have the RRR, which is the reserve requirement ratio. Basically, this requires banks to like hold on to more of their money and not lend it out as much, which influences the money supply. And the money supply is whether or not the money supply increases or decreases, whether or not the velocity of money increases or decreases, is a major factor into determining like how much inflation goes on, right? And also how much economic growth there is, really. In addition, they have discount rate. So discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed lends out to other banks, and this sort of helps set what the interest rates that other banks will lend out to normal people. So basically, like they can sort of set what is like the median interest rate for lending out loans, right? And this also influences the money supply because if the interest rate is higher, right, people are less willing to take loans out, but then banks are also more willing to give out loans and vice versa. And then finally, open market operations. Basically, the Fed has a bunch of money and they can use it. They can use it to buy bonds or sell bonds, right? And so, like whenever they buy bonds in a large quantity, they're basically taking their cash and dumping it onto the market, which influences the money supply. At the end of the day, like basically, they have to control inflation and unemployment rate. But these two things, using the Fed's tools, can often be like contrary. So the Fed's sort of role is to find that perfect balance of their tools to make sure that both inflation doesn't go up too high, but also unemployment doesn't go too low. So if you're really interested in this topic, you can also look into things such as the Okun's Law, the Monetary Policy Reaction Function, the MPRF, Taylor Rule, and basically all these things sort of connect the inflation rate and also the Fed's tools to the unemployment rate, and can sort of give you a better glimpse on that. And then real quickly, just to talk about how inflation can affect your debate rounds, a very common sort of link that people will use is they'll criticize some plan or they'll criticize some resolution because they'll argue that this resolution, all the spending for this resolution will lead to hyperinflation. And as Connor mentioned before, hyperinflation is sort of oftentimes a leading sign of like a recession or an economic sort of depression. And you can use that around as well because you can criticize a plan or argument or a resolution by saying like, this will lead to hyperinflation and which will eventually lead to an economic recession, which is bad for XYZ reasons. But yeah.
So a little bit moving on, like from these, I guess, like governmental issues, we can look at modernization theory. So modernization theory in debate is like, it's not really like a term that you hear around thrown around often, but it's like the idea is still applicable. So like in debate, achieving democracy might be like a topic you debate over a lot. And so like in simple terms, modernization theory seeks to find like the correlation between economic development and political development. And oftentimes this a lot of like modernization theory focuses on the steps towards evolving towards an ideal world, and typically that ends with democracy. And so there are three prominent ideas that I kind of want to go over today. First of all, being Samuel Lipset, he believed that achieving democracy would be easier if you become rich and then establish political institutions, since with money, it's easier to be legitimized and respected by other nations. He believed that this correlation meant that economic development is a social requisite to democracy. And considering factors such as national wealth, a large degree of industrialization, and high levels of education to be necessary fertilizers to prepare a breeding ground for democracy. So Przeworski focused more on hindsight, seeing that interestingly, no state that has ever hit a GDP of $6,055 has ever transitioned back from democracy to authoritarianism. And so the logic being is that as income gets higher, there's more emphasis on individual freedoms, especially in the middle class. And so there's no reason to go back to authoritarianism because these people have become used to the fact that they have these freedoms that they're, they like to have. And sorry, I see that Kessler says that what's GDP? So it's gross domestic product, gross domestic product. And as we said, it's a way, for example, to it's just like a net average on how much output a country puts out per year in terms of product. And then third, we go to learner. So learner's logic is like a bit more complicated. There's like a few more steps in between. So number one, it's become well-to-do. So like get some money in your pockets, basically. Then you should value urbanization and industrialization. Basically increase like your product and your businesses, and then increase literacy and media growth to develop strong culture, and then develop institutions of participation such as civil society organizations, non-government run organizations, and allow people to participate and organize like in these ways to develop your social like society and your culture. And you have to do it at a moderate pace. In this way, you can actually ingrain it over many years, so it becomes like a generational systemic thing into this like big picture like cultural setting. And then from there, you can establish a democracy. And so the reason why democracy is like such a valued topic is because in debate, a lot of like the value ideas you'll talk about is like equality, equity, as well as and which kind of like all like kind of leads in democracy, right? Because more power to the people, pretty much. So a lot of these ideas will be you will probably have to reflect inside your arguments. Like, how do your arguments basically reflect onto the fact like that you can achieve democracy? And so it's good to think about how economics really ties into this. But we do have to like critically think because some of these theories are like very distinct in their own manners. So if you're interested, you can definitely do your own research as to how applicable these theories actually are, like in legitimacy and like in real life. Um, Definitely some countries such as India and China are very unique in terms of their economic circumstance. Um, and so they may challenge like the traditional proposals of monetization theory. So definitely if you really are thinking about using some of these ideas in debate, definitely look into some of these because if anybody does know about it in debate rounds, it might criticize you. So just make sure you're able to defend that. So if you've like found other topics like previously to be like somewhat interesting, you might be interested in trade models. I just wanted to throw it in here because I thought it'd be good food for thought. Like we have mainly three prominent trade theories. First of all, by the guy that gave you Wealth of Nations, we have Adam Smith and his Invisible Hand, Stolper Samuelson and his Labor versus Capital Abundance, and the Ricardo Viner model, which is like sector-based interest. We don't really need to talk about it today, but it's just something to keep in mind if you want to go for it in research. So before Kenneth goes in depth to a lot of like the economic applications again, it's good to at least see like some of the causes of conflict that will tie into your like economic arguments when you debate. So like on your screen, you might see like some causes of conflict, especially inequality and poverty. You have colonial legacy, military governments and militaristic cultures, ethnicity and religion, unequal development, bad leadership and or fragile states, external influences, greed, and natural resources. So like pretty much every debate that you'll have related to economics will fit under like at least like one of these themes. Um, and typically inequality and poverty is like extremely important as that's one of the impacts that your plan hopes to solve. So just keep this in mind. And if you're ever thinking about like an argument that you're making, does it really fit into one of these causes of conflict? And how does yours, I guess, fix that type of conflict, for example?
Okay, so I mean, the reason learning economics is great and all, and learning is always great. But at the end of the day, we're talking about this sort of stuff because we want you to be able to apply this sort of analysis to your actual debate rounds, right? So I don't know the average experience of the people on this call regarding how much they've debated before, but I would say like, to be honest, like the best way to learn how to use economics in a debate round is to actually to be in a debate round, right? To know like what to sort of scope out a topic, do all the research behind it, and understand like how, like what the dimensions of arguments you can make are, and then go into the debate round, have some practice debates with either people that you know or just competitors, right? And that will help you sort of understand like how you can apply economic stuff um, to the round a lot better than you can just like theorizing about um, the ways you can apply economic analysis to the topic. But if you look at these, I think this is a list of the past public forum topics. So we have Nationals 2020, April 2020, March 2020, February, January, September, October. Basically all of these, I think except for December, which I left off, basically all of these topics are related to, or have some way in which you can relate economic analysis to them, right? So a very common way that you'll see economic analysis being used in a topic is to derive as an impact, right? So oftentimes people will say like, people will sort of relate, people will say like, the impact of this argument is that it leads to recession, right? Or the impact of this argument is that it leads to high economic growth. It leads to an economic boom because of XYZ reason, right? So we're gonna pick a random topic here. Number 4, if you look at February 2020 resolve, the United States should replace means-tested welfare programs with a universal basic income. This is a classic UBI topic, and you'll see that you've seen this. I think I've seen this in Lincoln Douglas before, as well as Public Forum, and then I think Parliamentary also really likes to run UBI topics because, and this topic is like at its heart is like a core economic question. It's a question that like economists around the country are currently debating as well regarding like how effective UBI is. And essentially what this is saying is like, this topic is asking like, should we replace our current social welfare systems that use a means test? Or in other words, it's a like, the way they like distribute social welfare or like welfare payments is to like test how much like money you make or how much income you receive currently, and then thereby like determine whether or not you qualify for these different social service programs. So they're considering whether or not we should replace this sort of means tested welfare with like a universal basic income, right? So a UBI is basically like distributing. The idea behind it is basically like we set out, say, $1,000 or $2,000, and we send it out to everybody in the U.S. or everybody in whatever country that it's being employed in. And when we send it out to everyone, we don't care about if they're Bill Gates or if like they're a welfare recipient. We just care that they are a U.S. citizen or a U.S. Resident, right? And so there's a lot of different like things you can talk about regarding economics in this topic. So you can consider like how effective. You can say like, let's say you are in the pro for this resolution. You can consider like saying that means tested welfare is actually counteractive to its goals, because there are a lot of people who should qualify for social services, but because there's a means tested sort of barrier, they're unable to qualify. Or you can also argue that the people who are, there's some people who qualify for means tested welfare because they are not making enough money to otherwise survive, right? And however, those people like are disincentivized to sort of increase their earnings or increase their income, because if they do so, they would actually end up making less money because of how the means tested welfare system works. There's also arguments on the other side. So you can, there's the very common argument of inflation. So people will attack universal basic income by saying that this will lead to inflation, because essentially the idea behind it is like you're giving a lot of money to everybody in the world, and eventually they're probably going to spend some of that money, right? And that is going to increase the money supply and thus lead to inflation. And as we mentioned before, hyperinflation is like a very good way to attack an argument, because we've seen historically that hyperinflation leads to economic recession, which is not a very good thing, right? So this one is clearly a very core economic issue, and a lot of the research you'll be doing for a UBI topic or something similar to this will be economics based. If we look at number 6 as well. Number 6, September-October 2019, resolved the European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a sort of geopolitical but also economic sort of question. So the Belt and Road Initiative is like China's like, I think, 21st century Silk Road initiative, and basically they're sort of extending across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and investing in infrastructure development. So basically this question is asking like, hey, should the EU also participate and invest in infrastructure development across like various developing nations? And so like there's a question of geopolitical impacts, because most likely the authors of this topic are regarding like, should the EU step in and like try and sap away some of the influence that China is having over these countries? Or is it not as effective, or is it not like worth it in terms of the massive amount of money that the EU would have to spend? So in terms of that regard, you can always have like some sort of economic impact and say that like the EU is just simply not solvent enough. They don't have enough money. They don't have the funds. Or if they do spend a lot of money on the Belt and Road Initiative, then it'll lead to defaults and more debt regarding the EU. And I think Connor covered earlier that like there are economic issues within the EU itself. So you can point that out and then lead to this impact of saying, don't do this because the EU will eventually lead to massive global recession. But yes, there's a lot of ways to look at the economics behind these issues. So I encourage you, if you have some free time, like later on, you should always look up past topics or look at some, example parliamentary topics or even policy topics, and think about impacts that you can sort of visualize, and then also think about like perhaps like how you can use economics to further your arguments in those topics. But yeah, so then we're going to talk specifically about economic impacts, and this should be very short. But basically, I'll go over per capita GDP. So Connor mentioned earlier that GDP is like probably the number one way people measure economic impact. It's a quantifiable number. You can see it like, this will lead to a 1% increase, or 2%, or 10% increase in GDP, or a 2%, 3% decrease in GDP. And these are always good ways to like quantify your impacts. And in debate, we love to quantify our impacts because that allows us to easily weigh them and measure them against other impacts, right? But a very good way to attack someone else's use of a GDP argument is to consider like how they're using it in the round, right? So if they say it's an increase to overall GDP or an increase to per capita GDP, so per capita means like per person. So it's essentially a way to measure the average standard of living, because you're saying like how much GDP per person is going to be increased. You can attack this by referring to like inequality, right? So GDP is an overall aggregate measure of like the demand for country, but also, and in turn also measures like the average income or the average sort of standard of living of each person in that country. But of course, averages are affected by the fact that like a lot of the money will probably tend to go towards the 1%, right, or the 0.01%, or the really rich and wealthy that already have a lot of the wealth and already like have enough money to survive, right? So you can attack a GDP number by saying like, for example, the US GDP will increase by 2%. But you can say that, you can attack that by saying, well, likely like 80% to 90% of that increase is going to go to Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, or Elon Musk, like the billionaires of the world who don't really need that money anyways. And so actually your impact is a lot less than what you say it actually is, right? And then so that's a really good way to like diminish someone else's impact and sort of say that it's not as good as they make it out to be. In addition, a very common economic impact is you look at the cost of some policy or program. And then of course, the aforementioned opportunity cost is a very big concept in economics, but also very big in debate. So you can consider like, well, this will cost XYZ amount of money, but it won't actually produce a lot of benefit for the economy, nor will it produce any benefit for the safety or for the quality of some reason. And we can use this money for a lot of other better things. Or if we're going to spend this money on this, we're going to have to cut money from the rest of our economy or the rest of our budget, which maybe like funding for schools, funding for education, funding for social services, funding for infrastructure, a lot of other good things that we care about. And, you know, you can make the argument to the judge saying that like these other things are actually more important than the impacts that this person is making. And then of course, some non-dollar like impacts that you can use in terms of economics is also unemployment. Unemployment is something we care about deeply because if you're unemployed, like it's very unlikely you'll have a good standard of living. So you can always refer to unemployment and other sort of measures of economic productivity. But yes. Before we go on to the other useful resources, I just wanted to pause and say like, we've talked a lot for a very long time. Are there any like general questions or any questions you have, any of y'all have? Feel free to like unmute yourself and talk about it, or type it in the chat.
Okay. But yeah, so these are some resources that I found to be really useful. Just like when I've been researching, for example, the first link up there from the St. Louis Fed is like really good in my opinion for econometrics, and I've heard from like I guess like professionals that it's like well, very trusted. Blogs by Economics Help is like I think really good. I think they go into a lot of detail, and there's like literally thousands of links that like are like really prevalent in what you can use in debate. So if you're interested, you can read that. It's like a literally a wormhole because like there's so many links inside of links. So you'll have fun reading that if you enjoy it. And yeah, there's just some other ideas that you can look into. But yeah, if there's any questions, please let us know. Please let us know. I guess if not, that'll be it for today, right? From us.
Oh, I just want to say, the St. Louis Fed is really like very impactful because basically they have like a bunch of graphs and like things you can make on your own on their website. And like, if I knew about this when I was doing debate, like I would have saved a lot of hours not having to do a lot of fruitless research. And like when you go to college and like if you study economics in college, like this is like what they use like all the time.
Cool. Thank you guys so much. Have fun with all of the lectures later today.